Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2021 Minnesota Book Award finalists in contention for the competitive Emilie Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. This year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota, and the Emilie Buchwald Award for Minnesota Nonfiction, sponsored by Bookmobile Craft Digital. My name is Christopher P. Lehman. I'm a professor of ethnic studies at St. Cloud State University, and I'm an author of several articles and a book about Minnesota's history. My book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders of the North Star State, won last year's Minnesota Book Award in this very category. As we get started, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land on which many of us on this panel recording are zooming in from today. This land was reserved for the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. We also acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. The Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of story in this place now called Minnesota. The Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, organizers of the Minnesota Book Awards, honor this tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state. For this latest installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Jane Lamm Carroll, author of Daybreak Woman and Anglo-Dakota Life, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Jane King Hession, author of Elizabeth Scheu Close, A Life in Modern Architecture, published by University of Minnesota Press. Sue Leaf, author of Minnesota's Geologist, The Life of Newton Horace Winchell, published by University of Minnesota Press. And Virginia Wright-Peterson, author of A Woman's War II, Women at Work During World War II, published by Minnesota Historical Society Press. Congratulations to each of you for the MNBA finalist nod. I've been in your shoes and I know how exciting this is. In the interest of making the most of our short time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like each of you to respond to in turn. I'll then have a question specific to each of you and your finalist book. First question for all of you to answer is based on what I noticed in reading the books. I noticed that there was quite a bit of deliberate inclusiveness, whether it was of people of color or of issues that women were facing, for those of you who wrote about women specifically. So what inspired you to tell a more inclusive story of Minnesota? Jane Lamm Carroll, you go first.
Well, this is work that I've been doing for almost 25 years, not specifically this book, but I teach women's history and I teach American history as a multicultural, multiracial history. Those are the two focuses of my career, really. And I've also come to realize as a teacher that one of the most effective ways of, I think, teaching history is through stories. And so this book really, is intersection of all three of those, I guess, missions, you could say, in my career, telling a story of a Euro-Indigenous woman as a way, also as a window into the broader history of the region. So,
thank you. Jane King Hession, your turn.
I didn't start out to write a story about inclusivity, but as I began to explore Elizabeth Scheu Close's life and career against the other life and careers I have written about male architects, it was very clear to me that she was facing conditions that were not common to everyone. So I became very interested in, how, in fact, did a woman back in the 1930s become the architect that she became, facing all of these obstacles. Another significant problem, I think, for women at the time was that there were no role models. And it occurred to me that very often you need to be inspired by someone, you need to follow someone. And that simply didn't exist for women in the field of architecture. So it became a story of how did she achieve this? How did she become an insider, if you will, beginning from a very outside position. She was also an immigrant to this country, came here at the age of 20 alone, came to Minnesota alone. So, how do you negotiate all of that? And that became a story of inclusivity as I went along.
Thank you. Sue Leaf, your turn.
Well, I do want to say at first that I tried not to write a biography of Newton Winchell because I felt like my geology knowledge was pretty thin and that I would be treading on thin ice at every turn. But the more I studied him, the more I read about him, the more I realized that he was an exemplary figure of early Minnesota science. And in the world that I was living in, it was acceptable to deny climate science. And even like this past year, it's been acceptable to deny epidemiological science and its value. And I thought, how many biographies of early Minnesota scientists do we know? We have plenty of biographies of politicians, but we don't have, science was alive and well, and the University of Minnesota was a hotbed of intellectual fervor and of early feminism. And Winchell was at the center of all of those. And so he was a natural. I kept coming back to him and thinking, yeah, this story needs to be told.
I'm glad it was. Thank you. Now, Virginia Wright-Peterson, your turn.
Yes, well, my interest in sort of unearthing absent or missing narratives started about 10 years ago when I was working for Mayo Clinic. And it was just about this time of year, we were approaching Women's History Month, and we decided to create a Jeopardy game about women, the early women of Mayo Clinic. And I went to the Mayo Clinic archive expecting to find a few tidbits about the 5 or so women that we had been told about in the early years, sort of the founding of Mayo Clinic. And it was like the archivists had been waiting for me to come because they had like boxes and folders and files of information on women that we'd never heard of. And I thought, my gosh, the whole sort of origination creation story of Mayo Clinic was extraordinarily male dominated, and there were a lot of women who'd been missing. So I started kind of teasing out those stories, wrote my first book, Women of Mayo Clinic, which ends in about 1943. And as that book was ending, I started finding tidbits of stories about what women did during World War II. A biophysicist at Mayo Clinic that was loaned to the War Department to work on radar. And that just it was like a thread in a sweater, right? I started pulling out more stories about women in Minnesota during World War II that I'd never heard of, doing things in areas that were just really surprising to me, working in the mines. We had our own Rosie the Riveters. So again, I was just intrigued and felt that those stories really needed to be told.
Thank you very much. Now for the second question for everybody. Jane Lamm Carroll, your question about your book specifically has to do with your bibliography, basically. Whenever I write about slavery, what strikes me is that I depend a lot on sources that don't specifically mention a slave. But regardless, the sources that I have are not written by the enslaved people themselves. So a lot of what I have to go on in terms of sources is from other people and not the subject of my research. And for Daybreak Women, that is certainly the case. You've had to find a lot of sources that were not written by Daybreak Woman herself. So my question is, which sources helped you to learn about Daybreak Woman's life?
The central challenge of the book was to write a biography of this woman, even though she left no account of her own life. She what has survived is, in terms of what I've been able to find, are only something like 7 letters that she wrote in her own hand. And when I say letters, that's generous because most of them are very short notes. One longer letter she wrote as a child. But yeah, so the central problem of this for me as a researcher was to recreate her life based on sources created by other people, mostly men. And most of those sources talked about the things around her or her family or the men in her family, or they were written in, luckily, one of the most important sources in terms of providing a framework for this book was the fact that her oldest son left quite a lengthy account of his own life. And because she never lived apart from her children throughout her entire life, that provided a framework, kind of the larger framework for me, and provided lots of clues for me in terms of where I could look for information. But this biography is very much about putting together scraps and snippets of information, either about her or indirectly about where she was living, the people she was living with, the events that were going on around her, and recreating her life that way. So it was the central challenge, but I came to realize at a certain point, and I've been doing research for quite some time on Euro-Dakota women and the relationships with Anglo-American men. And in the course of doing that research about these other women, her name kept coming up, her family's name kept coming up, and I reached a point where I realized, there's probably enough information for me to put together a biography. Having said that, I was really, her son's account provided lots of information up through the Dakota War and for a few years after that. But really, I was worried about the last decades of her life. She lived till 1904. And I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to fill those in at all. And I was really, really lucky in finding correspondence that her youngest, mainly of her youngest son, that had been preserved in the papers of another family, the Brown family, because her 2 youngest children married into the Brown family. So that correspondence was vital, his correspondence. And again, it wasn't so much that he talked about her specifically, although sometimes he did, but she was with him, right? So she was with their family. So that really helped me locate her. And also the correspondence, of course, reveals things that other sources don't, like relationships, right? Family events, how households were composed, who was living with whom. So I was really, really lucky in finding that the correspondence in for those last decades. But I will say that even though I only had those, some 7 letters or notes that she wrote in her own hand, they really acted as anchors for me, because it was very difficult to keep her at the center of the story, because the sources were, kind of all around her or indirect. But I could use those notes or letters she wrote at different points in her life to really anchor. And they were key for me too, in that they came at times in her life when the surrounding sources, the indirect sources, could not tell me certain things about her, and that I only came to know from the little tidbits of information in those short notes or letters that she wrote herself. So they were really invaluable, even though I didn't have very many of them. And so they really acted as anchors for that thread, that narrative thread of her life for me, and keeping her at the center, which was something I really struggled with throughout, putting her there, even though the sources didn't talk about her. I had to, it's like a portrait. It's kind of like a portrait where she was missing all the time, and I had to keep painting her back in my imagination otherwise I'd get lost, you know, and go off somewhere else. So.
I certainly appreciate what you said about using her words as the anchor, because I'm trying to do the same thing for my follow-up book. It's about one of the individual enslaved people that I mentioned briefly in Slavery's Reach, but there's just not that much that she had written herself. There's, I think, an affidavit, and then whatever words she was quoted as saying in the newspapers at that time. And as I've looked at outside sources, I found myself also drifting away from the main person. So you're right, that is very hard to do. So thank you for saying that. Now for Jane King Hession, your second question. You wrote about Close's designs in the context of the Cold War and about how the United States would use her architecture to promote the American way of life. Your book also mentions a housing project that she designed and how it at some point had been segregated by skin color. And in my own studies of African Americans, especially slavery, it is very clear that art and that architecture as part of art is political. I mean, all you would have to do is look at the mansion or the big house and compare it to the quarters of the enslaved person, which was basically a shack or a small cabin. So how did writing about Close influence your understanding of architecture as political?
Well, in my work, I'm very interested in not only what is built, but who built it and why and what conditions allowed them to build that. And politics and economics are always involved in the equation. And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's big, and sometimes it's very subtle and small. And I have to go back a little bit to her background. She was born in 1912 in Vienna, Austria, and she lived in a big house. She was someone who was raised in a big house. But her father, actually her grandfather, founded the Austrian Social Democratic Party. So her family was very involved in social situations. And post-World War I, her father was very involved in providing housing for the city of Vienna for people in need. So she understood that architecture had the power and perhaps the responsibility to be socially responsible and to react to situations that need to be reacted to. Her mother was Jewish, so when the Nazis were rising to power in Vienna, she had to leave. Also, the politics of education in Vienna for a woman at the time were making it impossible for her to continue her education. She couldn't register for classes. There were no female restroom facilities. So she had to leave due to politics. Now, when she came to the United States in 1932 and finished her education by 1935, it was the Depression. So she was trying to find a job in the Depression, and that political and economic situation shaped the kind of architecture she would do. You mentioned the project in Minneapolis, which was Sumner Field, that she worked on, that was segregated in part by race. She was a draftsperson on that project, so she did not design it. She was minimally involved. She was interested in a project of that kind that she believed would have a larger social agenda. I don't think she reckoned on the segregation at all. That was not anything that she would have considered or approved of. To your point of how the United States government used one of her designs, I think that's a particularly fascinating chapter in her life. She was designing prefab houses during the war for defense house workers. And then she segued into designing prefab houses. And over 10,000 of houses of her design were built across the upper Midwest. But in 1951, the State Department selected one of them to send to Berlin to represent the typical American house at the Berlin International Exposition. Berlin was a divided city at the time. It was all about the capitalism in the West and communism in the East. And this house was used as a representation of how Americans lived and how you could live in the Eastern Bloc if you were to embrace capitalism and reject communism. She was never credited for the design of that house. Her name did not appear at all in the publications, the enormous propaganda that was disseminated about that house. But I think it was just very interesting that it was an average kind of typical prefab house, one of 10,000, and it became very significant as a propaganda tool for the United States government during the Cold War.
I see. And overall, you just did a really good job of writing a compelling biography, as well as a great picture book. I mean, the pictures in the book are fantastic. So thank you for writing that.
Well, thank you very much.
Mhm. Now, Sue Leaf, your second question is about how you also wrote a very compelling biography, and it was in the context of the study of geology. And you spoke about this yourself in your answer to your first question. And I was also very pleasantly surprised to read multiple references to the indigenous in your book, especially when Winchell uses various indigenous people as guides when he's doing his geology work. So what most fascinated you about Winchell's concern for accuracy in his references to the indigenous?
Well, the easy answer to the question is that Winchell was meticulous about everything. And that's what enables working geologists today to reach to a shelf and take out his maps and consult with them because they know the work wasn't sloppy. But of course, the underlying sense is that Winchell believed that the people indigenous to Minnesota mattered, that they were worthy of respect, and that meant for him an accurate and fair account of their lives and their cultures as he was writing this book on, a comprehensive book on the culture of the Ojibwe and the Dakota and their past leaders as far as he could make it fair. This interest in the indigenous peoples dates back to his earliest days as a field researcher, a field geologist. When he was 20 and working as a botanist on the Michigan Geological Survey, he visits a Catholic missionary village. He comes across, and he's horrified by the what he called the tyrannical rule of the priest. And he sees a nunnery. It's attached to a nunnery, and the nunnery has young women that he thinks have been taken from their native villages and forced into a life of inactivity and seclusion, which he deplored, found terrible, despicable, in fact. So in his 20s, he was already keeping a list of Ojibwe words in the back of his field journal, their pronunciations and their meanings. He was very interested in how they saw the world. The use of the Ojibwe guides for his geological survey of the northeastern Minnesota was an absolute necessity. He had written home to his wife that if he did not have them, he would not have been able to find his way through the morass of waterways up in the Boundary Waters area because there wasn't anyone living there. The Ojibwe, of course, knew it very well. They knew the portages. They knew how the lakes connected to each other. And they also made his watercraft that he took to get into that area. He bought a birch bark canoe from the Grand Portage Band. And I think that canoe is still in the possession of the Minnesota Historical Society today. In fact, someone told me it's hanging from the ceiling at the Minnesota Science Museum, and I haven't just been down there to see it. But what fascinated me, well, in the book, The Aborigines of Minnesota, he got the names attached to the photographic portraits accurately spelled. He was a stickler about this. Ojibwe names are long and phonetic, and it was a big task wrestling them into publishable form. And he wasn't just content to list the names, but he also added personality traits of the various leaders to make them kind of pop for the average reader. Likewise, he included in that book 25 pages of 1,400 names of Ojibwe people, men and women, and not necessarily leaders. And he included information about them, and he got it down on paper to share to the rest of the world.
That's impressive, especially considering the time that he was working in, that he was so focused on having um, a grassroots on up approach versus top down. So I appreciate you making that part of the story. Thank you. And now for Virginia Wright-Peterson, your second question. At several points, your book discusses discrimination that women face based on ethnicity, whether it's Japanese internment or how Jim Crow, how it affected Jewish people as well, and how there was an Ojibwe woman who was able to maneuver through Jim Crow by passing as white. And so the stories seem to have a common thread in terms of Jim Crow as well as through whatever they faced as women. So what struck you about how interwoven the discrimination was among the women?
Yes, thank you for that question. The discrimination that the women faced was really layered. First, just for being women, I appreciated what Jane said about the bathrooms. That was one of the excuses the military gave for not wanting women in the military. Well, we just don't have bathrooms for them. But like Eleanor Roosevelt wasn't having any of that, and definitely pressured and encouraged the military to incorporate them. And just all of the areas that they went into, the mines, they were a part of the Office of Strategic Services in various areas. That entity became the CIA, and they faced discrimination even once they were in that organization. So in lots of different ways, in their pay, a lot of things that even I guess we know still continue today. But you're right. Then it was sort of layered with ethnic, racial tensions, religious discrimination as well. One of the stories relates to a woman who, it was interesting trying to define a woman from Minnesota, right? I first started with the idea that they would be born here, but then I came across the powerful story of a woman who was born in Germany, Jewish, and ended up being a part of the resistance movement there and was incarcerated in concentration camps because of her religion. And what was interesting though as well is even after everything she went through and got to the United States and eventually with her husband, they decided to take a trip and go to some resorts, and then they started facing discrimination of the resorts that they could go to in the United States because they were Jewish. And they certainly didn't expect that by the time they got to the United States. So definitely a story there of what she dealt with. You mentioned the Ojibwe woman who was able to be a part of the Coast Guard, and yes, being a part of the military in that experience was somewhat liberating for her in that she was fair-skinned, as she saw it, and was able to pass for white, and just sort of what perceptions that gave her and how that sort of motivated her at the end of her service, not only in the Coast Guard, but she went on to be with the State Department when she returned to the Minneapolis area and was very instrumental in creating Native American community centers and services for people. So it had a profound, I think, even though she was able to sort of escape some of the discrimination she had previously faced, it really changed and motivated her perceptions when she returned to Minnesota. There's also an African-American woman who was in the Red Cross, and she was able to share a lot of narratives about what it was like to be in a segregated unit that went on to New Guinea, and talked a lot about the racism around our blood supply. The Red Cross's blood supply during the war was also segregated. At first, donations by African Americans weren't even accepted by the Red Cross. But then once they were, all of that blood needed to be segregated. So Prudence Burns shares some amazing stories with us along those lines, as well as a woman who lived in the Minneapolis, St. Paul area, the Twin Cities area, and worked in retail. And the discrimination she endured, her husband was in the service, and she was making a living while he was away. segregation in the employee cafeterias and many things along those lines. So there were definitely multiple ways that these women endured, showed an immense amount of strength, and really succeeded in new arenas.
We have time for another quick round robin question. This category stands apart as one with a relatively larger timetable of writing because of all the research that's involved. So what was the timetable for you from your original idea to write the book through the whole period of writing to the publication date? And Jane Lamb Carroll, go first.
Well, for me, in a way, that question is a little bit difficult to answer because in writing this book, I very much drew on really decades of research and work I've done in the region's history, in Minnesota history, and then more recently in relationships between Euro-Dakota women and Dakota women and Anglo-American men and their families. But for this particular book, I would say my attention became focused on Daybreak women probably about 8 years ago. And because I'm a full-time professor, I have to do my research, in between teaching. And so it took some time. It took a lot of time to get all the research together. And then, of course, writing took some time as well. So yeah, I'd say about probably 8 years from the point of time I started to focus on Daybreak women to publication of the book.
Okay, thank you. Jane King Hession, your turn.
Well, this didn't actually even begin as a book. It began as an oral history that I conducted with Liesl on behalf of the Minnesota Historical Society, and it quickly became evident to me as I was talking to her that it needed to be a book. Now that occurred in 2000, so this is 20 years ago. Along the way, I needed to get to Vienna to do some research on her early years, so I needed to secure a grant, and that all takes some time. I did write 3 other books in between, so I wasn't exactly idle, but writing a book, as we all know, takes a very long time on in a lot of areas. It's about research, it's about distant research sometimes, it's about funding, it's about grant proposals, it's about book proposals, and all of that takes an extraordinary amount of time. I was very fortunate to have Liesl for at least part of this. She passed away in 2012. Her family. So it was, I would say, the last 3 or 4 years before publication, I worked on it intensely and exclusively. But it had a very long gestational period, which I think was good because during that time your ideas start to settle in and you begin to realize that maybe what you thought was important when you started out or the way you were going to go isn't the way you actually go. So you learn what's important and you learn to let go of things. So I think having that luxury of time in a way was very beneficial for my project and probably for most projects.
Thank you. Right. Sue Leaf, your turn.
Well, my idea for something on Winchell actually began when I was at work on another biography, a student of his, T.S. Roberts, who is connected with the Bell Museum. Roberts, when he was a teen, formed a naturalist club, and the teenagers discussed scientific topics. And one of the topics they discussed was Darwin's theory of natural selection, which was only 15 years old at the time. And they had a paper by Alfred Russel Wallace, who shared the discovery of the theory with Darwin, that they were discussing. And I looked up the paper, and it had been presented in Glasgow only 4 months earlier. And this is in like in 1874, 75. And I thought, how on earth could teenagers in Minneapolis, which still had mud streets, get a hold of a paper of this sophistication? And the only answer would have been their professor at the University of Minnesota, which is Winchell. So that began that started to rivet my attention on him. That was probably in 2009 or so. And I finished by Robert's biography. I wrote another book. And then I kept, like I said, he kept haunting me until I actually sat down and started looking at his life. And his life was so varied. And I found out he was married to the first woman elected to public office in Minnesota. And I thought, my goodness, there's a lot here with this guy. So the last, I'd say from 2015 on, I was focused on Winchell, and it took a while to get it published, just because I do an index, and I had my publisher right away because the Roberts book sold so well.
Good, thank you. Now, Virginia Wright-Peterson, your turn.
Yes, well, as I mentioned, I became interested in the stories of women from Minnesota during World War II as I was finishing my book about Mayo Clinic and found a couple of stories. And that would have been around 2016. But there was a lot of work ahead of me because I did not know much about World War II at all. I mean, I was probably like the last time I'd really studied, it would have been maybe in high school. So I really had to spend a lot of time reading about the war itself, figuring out the timelines, because the women were in all of these different places. They were at the fall of Paris, and then its liberation, and Dunkirk, Dachau. I mean, just all of it. And so I really had to, and then the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, I had no idea really that the war took place, on the ground in Alaska as well. So I had a lot of reading and work just to do on the general topic itself. But then I was also really committed to making this a book that went beyond sort of Rochester and Mayo Clinic. I wanted to include women from throughout the state, which turned out to be really easy to do in one way because there were so many stories. The women on the Iron Range were involved in the war at amazing levels, proportionately more than probably any other area in the United States. And so I had to spread out and get stories from all geographic areas. I also didn't want it to be so centered on the Twin Cities, right? So getting out to stories from Grand Forks and Fairmont, Minnesota, and Cloquet. So that was a little bit challenging, as well as the industries. I mean, I was in archives in Hormel, the women in the meat packing plants, at the State Historical Society, at the National Archives in Maryland. I went out there because so many of the military records are held there. So it was really a scavenger hunt a little bit, as I tried to make sure all branches of the military, all industries, all aspects of the war. It's basically a retelling of World War II, but with the women's stories included. So from that standpoint, it was 3 years of finding the stories in some of them in amazing places. Somebody's family scrapbook became a resource for me. So it was fun. It was an absolute joy. But as the other authors on the panel have said too, it's very time consuming, and we all have day jobs, I guess, as you put it. And so trying to fit this in, even my grandchildren were really getting frustrated with the book by the end because Grandma can't spend time with us. She's got to finish her book. And I was really grateful to Minnesota Historical Society, who published the first book, to be very willing to help me bring the stories of these more broad stories of women throughout Minnesota to the forefront.
Thank you.
Could I just echo something that Jane said earlier about the leisure of time
Oh, go ahead.
in the process? I found when I actually started writing the manuscript that I was so grateful that it took me, I think from the first draft of the first chapter, it was probably over 2 years of the writing process. And the book is so much better than it would have been even a year into the writing process, that I'm really grateful that that I had that time to develop the book in terms of writing, and it changed so much over those 2 or 2.5 years, that it, as I said, in the end, it was so much better than it would have been a year earlier if I had finished it a year earlier. So yes, the leisure of having that time was really, really important to me.
Can I add something here? I want to give a shout out to my my writing group, because they made my book so much better, and they made it actually because they're educated and they knew very little about geology. It forced me to go back to the most basic fundamentals of geology and put it on paper so that people could appreciate what kind of knowledge Winchell had to work with. So it was not only the fundamentals of geology, but the fundamentals of the history of geology. And I think that book gave me the book more context and a kind of a broader feel for the appreciation of science.
Thanks to all of our tremendous Minnesota Nonfiction category finalists, and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. In particular, mark your calendars for Thursday, April 29th. That's the evening that the winner in this literary category and 8 others are finally revealed. It will be entirely online. Attendance is free, but registration is required. Visit thefriends.org/MNBA to reserve your spot. Enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe and healthy. Goodbye, and thank you.